The thoughts of actually seeing the bone itself don't resonate in my head. The thought that I was standing over the remains of two children does resonate with me.
There are crime scenes that haunt investigators because they're brutal, and then there are crime scenes that haunt them because they make absolutely no sense. In November 1985, a hunter walked into the woods of Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire, expecting nothing more than a quiet day outdoors. Instead, he stumbled across a rusting 55-gallon metal barrel, partially hidden beneath the trees. Inside was a discovery so disturbing that police immediately sealed off the area. The barrel contained the remains of a woman and a young girl. Who they were, how they got there, and who wanted them erased from the world, nobody knew. Investigators searched desperately for answers. Missing persons reports were checked. Dental records were compared. Tips poured in. Every promising lead eventually reached the same dead end. The victims had names, somewhere, but to the world, they became Jane Does. Most cold cases fade because the trail grows cold. This one was different. The more detectives searched, the stranger it became. There were no witnesses, no obvious suspect, no identification. It was as if these two people had simply appeared inside that barrel and vanished from history. Years passed. The case slowly slipped from newspaper headlines. Investigators retired. Families moved on. The forest reclaimed its silence. Most people believed the mystery would never be solved. But then, something happened that almost no one saw coming. 15 years after the first barrel was discovered, investigators returned to the exact same patch of woods. Not because of a new witness, not because someone confessed, but because a detective refused to believe the woods had given up all of their secrets. What they uncovered next didn't just reopen the investigation, it completely changed it. Buried nearby was another barrel, and inside it were the remains of two more young girls. In a single moment, detectives realized they had never been investigating one murder. They were hunting something far more terrifying. 4 victims, 2 barrels, one mystery that was growing instead of shrinking. But the biggest shock wasn't waiting inside the barrels, it was waiting inside the killer's identity. In the next chapter, investigators begin pulling apart decades of forgotten evidence, and one tiny clue starts pointing toward a man who seemed to exist everywhere, yet somehow wasn't who he claimed to be. The deeper they dig, the more impossible this case becomes. The discovery of the second barrel changed everything. Investigators were no longer looking for a single killer who had hidden 2 victims. They were hunting someone who had managed to keep 4 murders buried for years without leaving behind a single clear trail. But the biggest mystery wasn't who the victims were, it was who the killer really was. For years, detectives chased names that led nowhere. Every promising lead seemed to disappear. Every witness remembered someone slightly different. Every record revealed another contradiction. It was as though the man they were searching for had spent his entire life becoming someone else whenever it suited him. At first, investigators believed the victims were unrelated. Then forensic examinations revealed something that completely changed the direction of the case. 2 of the girls shared the same mother. That single discovery transformed the investigation overnight. The killer hadn't chosen random victims. There was a connection, a family connection. But if the 2 girls were related, where was their mother? And more importantly, who was their father? That question would haunt detectives for years. The answers weren't sitting inside police files. They were buried inside forgotten identities, abandoned relationships, and decades of carefully constructed lies. Every time investigators believed they had found the man's real name, another document contradicted it. One driver's license, another birth date, different signatures, different jobs, different cities. It wasn't just deception, it was a pattern. Whoever this man was, he had been reinventing himself for decades. Then another disturbing fact emerged. Several women who had known him described the same thing. He could be charming, helpful, soft-spoken, the kind of man neighbors trusted. But behind closed doors, his personality changed completely. Control became obsession. Manipulation became routine. Fear became normal. Investigators began to wonder whether the Bear Brook victims were only part of a much larger story. And if they were, how many people had crossed paths with this man without ever realizing who he really was? Years passed. Technology improved. Old evidence was examined again. DNA techniques that hadn't existed when the barrels were first discovered suddenly offered investigators something they had never had before: hope. Not because they finally had a suspect, but because science could now answer questions that witnesses never could. One DNA profile, one family connection, one forgotten branch of a family tree. It was the first real crack in a mystery that had survived for decades. Detectives could finally see light at the end of the tunnel. But the truth waiting there was stranger than anyone imagined, because the man behind Bear Brook wasn't simply hiding from police. He had been hiding from his own identity. And when investigators uncovered his real name, they also uncovered a past filled with disappearances, abandoned families, and secrets stretching across multiple states. What they were about to discover wouldn't just identify a killer, it would reveal a man who had spent years convincing the world he was someone he had never been. For nearly 30 years, investigators had been chasing a ghost. Every lead ended the same way. Another false name, another dead end, another identity that simply disappeared. It seemed impossible that one man could erase himself so completely. But in the early 2000s, the investigation took a turn no detective from 1985 could have imagined. The answer wasn't waiting in another witness interview. It wasn't hidden inside an old police report. It was hidden inside DNA. Forensic scientists began using genetic genealogy, a technology that could connect unidentified victims and unknown suspects through distant relatives. It was painstaking work. Thousands of family connections. Countless public records. Every branch of every family tree had to be examined. For the first time, investigators weren't asking, "Who is our suspect?" They were asking, "Who are his relatives?" That subtle change transformed the entire investigation. Then came the breakthrough. The DNA pointed investigators toward a man who had lived under several different names. One identity stood out: Bob Evans. For years, that was the name many people knew him by, but it wasn't his real name. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered Bob Evans had never truly existed. It was another mask, another carefully constructed lie. Eventually, every fake identity led back to one man: Terry Peter Rasmussen, a drifter, a serial liar, a man who moved from state to state, leaving broken families behind. Whenever questions followed him, he simply became someone else. New name, new job, new town, new life. And somehow, no one connected the pieces. But identifying Rasmussen only created another mystery. Detectives now knew who he was. They still didn't know who all of his victims were. The woman found inside the first barrel remained unidentified. One of the young girls still had no name. Imagine that. Even after discovering the killer's true identity, some of the victims were still waiting to be recognized. It was a heartbreaking reminder that solving a murder isn't always the same as restoring a person's identity. Then investigators uncovered something even more disturbing. Rasmussen wasn't just linked to Bear Brook. He had been connected to other disappearances, other suspicious deaths, and abandoned children scattered across multiple states. The deeper detectives looked into his past, the darker it became. Every answer uncovered another victim. Every solved mystery exposed another unsolved one. It was as though Rasmussen had spent his entire life leaving human tragedies behind, confident that no one would ever connect them. But time was finally catching up with him. Technology had accomplished what decades of detective work alone could not. The man who had hidden behind countless identities had finally been exposed. Yet the investigation was far from over, because one question still refused to go away. If Terry Rasmussen had been hiding for decades, how many victims had the world still not found? And that question would lead investigators to one final chapter: one that would give some families long-awaited answers, while proving that even after death, the truth has a way of finding those who tried hardest to bury it. For decades, the killer's identity had overshadowed everything else. Investigators finally knew who Terry Peter Rasmussen was, but the people he had stolen from the world were still waiting for something just as important: their names. A murder investigation doesn't truly end when the killer is identified. It ends when the victims are finally brought home. And in the Bear Brook case, that proved to be the hardest part of all. Years after Rasmussen had been exposed, investigators returned once again to the evidence. Not because they believed the killer would confess. He never would. He had died in prison in 2010. Whatever secrets he still carried, he took with him. So detectives turned to the only witness that couldn't lie: DNA. By this point, genetic genealogy had advanced dramatically. Scientists could compare tiny fragments of DNA with massive family trees built from public genealogy databases. It was slow, painstaking. Sometimes months of work produced nothing. Then, one family tree began matching the unidentified woman. The breakthrough was extraordinary. After more than 30 years, investigators finally learned her name: Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch. She wasn't just another victim. She was a young mother. And suddenly, the investigation made heartbreaking sense. The two girls found with her were her daughters, Marie Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWaters, 3 members of the same family, hidden together for decades. For investigators, it was both a victory and a tragedy. 3 Jane Does were Jane Does no longer, but one child still remained unidentified: the youngest girl. She had become known simply as Bear Brook Jane Doe. Who was she? How had she ended up with Rasmussen? Why had no one ever reported her missing? It was another mystery hiding inside an already impossible case. Investigators refused to stop. Again, they relied on genetic genealogy. Again, they built family trees one branch at a time. Years passed. Then came another breakthrough. The little girl was identified as Dawn Ray Rasmussen, Terry Rasmussen's biological daughter. Even more heartbreaking, she had spent decades without a name because almost no one knew she even existed. For the first time in nearly 40 years, every victim found inside those barrels had been identified. Every one. Families finally received answers they had waited a lifetime to hear. The names replaced the labels. The victims were no longer evidence. They were daughters, a mother, children, people whose lives had mattered. But although investigators had answered the biggest questions, one uncomfortable truth remained. No one knows exactly how many victims Terry Rasmussen may have left behind. Even today, detectives continue examining unsolved disappearances connected to his movements across the United States. Because men like Rasmussen don't simply vanish from history. They leave shadows, and sometimes, those shadows stretch farther than anyone first imagined. In the final chapter, we'll see how one forgotten case transformed criminal investigations forever, and why the Bear Brook murders continue to influence cold case investigations across America decades later. Most cold cases end with an arrest. The Bear Brook murders ended with something far more powerful: the truth. It took nearly 4 decades, hundreds of investigators, countless hours of forensic work, and scientific breakthroughs that didn't even exist when the first barrel was discovered. But in the end, every victim was given back the one thing the killer had tried to erase forever: their identity. Terry Peter Rasmussen spent much of his life believing he could outrun his past. Whenever suspicion followed him, he disappeared. A new name, a new job, a new town, a new family. Again and again, he convinced people he was someone else. For years, it worked. Not because he was a criminal mastermind, but because the technology needed to expose him hadn't been invented yet. Ironically, the very thing Rasmussen counted on, time, became the reason he was finally exposed. Every year that passed brought better forensic science, better DNA analysis, better investigative techniques. The mystery didn't survive because detectives stopped trying. It survived because the answers simply weren't possible at the time. Eventually, science caught up. And when it did, the lies Rasmussen had built over decades collapsed one by one. The Bear Brook investigation changed more than a single cold case. It proved that even after decades of silence, victims can still be identified, families can still receive answers, and killers, who believed they had escaped history, can still be unmasked. Today, detectives across the world use the same genetic genealogy techniques that helped solve Bear Brook to reopen cases once thought impossible. Cases where names had been forgotten. Cases where evidence had gone cold. Cases where hope had almost disappeared. Bear Brook became proof that a cold case isn't always a dead case. Sometimes, it's simply waiting for the right piece of science, or the right investigator, or the right question. The barrels hidden deep inside a quiet New Hampshire forest were meant to keep a terrible secret forever. Instead, they became one of the most important cold case investigations in modern American history. Not because evil won, but because persistence did, because every victim deserved a name, because every family deserved an answer, and because no matter how carefully someone hides the truth has a remarkable way of finding its way back to the surface. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the Redwire Archive. Every documentary we create explores real cases, forgotten evidence, and the investigations that changed everything. There are countless stories still waiting to be uncovered, and you won't want to miss the next one.